thing. All right, Jason, take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's my great honor and privilege to introduce to you Charlie Cheever, a man I worked with years ago in the early days of his current project, Expo. I remember when it was just a little project with 2 full-time people, him and his co-founder, and now it's a beautiful company full of, I don't even actually know, but 40 people or 30 people or something. And it was a real treat to get to learn from him over the years. And I still consider him a dear friend. And I highly recommend that you pay attention to every word of every sentence that he says, because there are deep nuggets of wisdom embedded there. And I still learn stuff to this day from him all the time. So it's a great honor. I don't want to take up any more of his time. I'll kick it over to him to give you a demo of his project. And I'm sure you'll have lots of questions, which we'll handle at the end of the talk. Go ahead, Charlie.
Cool. Thanks so much, Jason. You're always too kind. So I thought I would just give the reason I want to talk to people at South Park Commons is I thought that the thing that I've been working on for the last couple of years might be helpful to some people. And so I thought I would just give a quick demo and like a pretty high level overview of like what Expo is and what it does and how it might help you. And then, obviously feel free to interrupt me anywhere along the way or at the end with questions. Happy to just like dive into anything that anyone wants to know here. And so cool. I'm going to share my screen a little bit. Is this working? Does that work?
Yeah, we can see.
Okay, cool. Yeah, so thanks for having me. So wait, how do I go back? Just to give a little bit of background, kind of the origin and genesis of this project is that like a long time ago, I was working at this company Quora, and we were like a new website and we were getting pretty popular, and it was like 2010, and I was noticing that everyone was using their phones all the time and people were yelling at me for checking Twitter too much. And so we decided we need to build an iPhone app. And this was my first experience building a mobile app, and it really was eye-opening because what we decided was we were in a big hurry because we didn't have a big team. So we thought, okay, what we'll do is we'll just take our mobile website, which is pretty good, and we'll wrap it in like a native tab bar. And so I took some people who'd done some work on Mac before and some C++ programming before, and had them like try to do this as quickly as possible. And I thought it would take 3 weeks or something to just literally wrap our mobile website in a tab bar. And instead, like 9 months later, we're finally submitting to the App Store for review, and waiting for that. And it was just really remarkable to me how much work and time that took just to deal with stuff. Things have gotten a bit better since then. People write Swift instead of Objective-C. Some of the tooling is better, but fundamentally, it's not too different of a process. And then layered on top of that, once the iPhone app launched, it was like pretty popular and people liked it. Like I think the first month it was already 10% of the traffic to the service. And so we kind of knew like, okay, this is going to be a big deal. This is going to be a huge component of our usage in the future. So we have to take this seriously. Let's build an Android app now. We want to get this out quickly too. So and it took a long time on iOS, but we at least don't want to rebuild everything from scratch. So let's reuse the web view again, and hopefully this will go quickly. And it took us 10 months to wrap sort of our mobile website in a view on Android. So there are a couple things. Sorry, was there a question? Oh, I guess not. So that was just really frustrating to me. And there were a couple things about that were annoying. So after I left Quora, I was just thinking about what I wanted to do next. And almost everything I thought about was I need to make a mobile app because that's the only thing that's interesting. The way that people use software is on mobile. And so making something that's just a website feels just not very exciting to me. But then when I think about actually doing that, I was kind of oh gosh, I'm going to spend a year of my life making anything I can think of. So this is a napkin drawing of some idea I had from back in the day. The idea was kind of it's a silly idea, but I'll explain it just to illustrate the point. The idea was kind of that I had this idea that I would make an app that was like Uber or Lyft, but that I was the only driver on it. And so like that way, if I haven't seen Bubba in years, and if Bubba emails me and says, hey, let's grab coffee, we'll probably email back and forth 5 or 6 times, and then like maybe eventually find some time to get a beer or coffee or something like that. But then we each have to drive, we have to park, and we have to meet up, and somebody's usually late, and the whole thing ends up like shooting your whole afternoon, your evening. And so you don't do it as much as you should. And when you do, it often just like takes over your whole day. So the idea is like, what if Bubba needs to go to the airport or the dentist? And I just happen to be in the area because I'm not doing anything, because I'm not working right now, because I'm trying to think of what to do next. What if I could just give him a ride to wherever he needs to go, and then we can hang out instead of hanging out with some random Uber driver or Lyft driver? You can hang out with me. He saves money. I get to meet up with someone and catch up and feel useful all in one. And like you can kind of see like the reason I give this example when I talk about this is that you can kind of see, if you squint and you kind of use your imagination, you can kind of see how this could work, and how like this could start to become like a thing that people actually use, and then maybe other people start to get involved, and like they want to have their own personal ride apps, and then it becomes sort of a network, and it becomes like a big thing. But then you can also take a step back and be like, no, that's just a stupid, silly idea. Like, who would do that instead of taking a regular Uber? And like, if it was really your close friend, you would just text. Like, there's all kinds of reasons why this wouldn't work. And so it's really unclear whether it would be a good idea to work on or not. And when that's the case, it's really, really important that it's just cheap to build. Because when I thought about building this, I was thinking, man, if this was just a website, I could make this in a weekend or maybe a week. And that's totally worth it to try out an idea like this. But when I think about spending a year of my life to make just an iOS version that's really brittle, it's hard to iterate on, that doesn't work for the third of my friends that use Android phones or whatever, it's like, man, that just feels like it's just like not worth rolling the dice with like a whole year of my life for something that's just sort of a silly idea. And so I end up just like every idea I thought of, I kept running into this problem, this like deeper problem of it's just too hard to build mobile software compared to the web. And so, I got my co-founder James to quit his job, and we just started thinking about this all the time. And so now we've built this thing Expo, and it's used by lots of people, including Flex, Blackline, Cameo, Code Academy, Flexport, Business Insider, Pizza Hut, Fortify, Pretty Little Thing, which is a big fashion retailer that probably none of us buy clothes at. Shapeshift, which is a big security company, and Spikeball, the game you see in Dolores Park, and other things, and many, many other companies and government agencies. The Thai police force uses it, and the Saudi Arabian Health Ministry, and the EPA. Lots of people. 300,000 projects in GitHub rely on it, and we have hundreds of thousands of developers use it. People say nice things about it. I'm having trouble staying on the slides. These are just some, when I was making these slides, this is just some random stuff that I pulled off Twitter. People just saying nice things about it. And then, so what is it? It is basically like 3 things. It's a set of open source tools, a comprehensive standard library, and cloud services to complement the above. What we can do right now actually is I can actually give you guys a really quick demo, just because I think that's the easiest way for me to kind of give you a taste of what Expo is, instead of trying to spend 20 minutes like explaining everything that offers. So why don't we just do that right now? So what I would ask you to do is, if you have your phone with you, go to the Play Store if you have an Android, or go to the App Store if you have an iPhone, and search for Expo Go. And you should be able to find that app there, and just start downloading it. And if you do that, it should be the first result. If you search for Expo Go, it just says like productivity. You should go down, and that's kind of like a tool that we offer that helps with development. And then I'll put this URL in that's listed here on this slide. I'll put it in the Zoom chat so that you can get it there. Where is the chat? Chat. And so on your computer, click on this link that I just put in the chat, or that comes up on the slide. And what you'll see, I think, is I'm actually going to share this other window now, and hopefully you see that. Can people see my screen still? And so what you can do now is you can just, if you have an iPhone, open the native camera on it. And if you have an Android phone, open Expo Go client and tap on like scan QR code. And if you just point it at the screen where you see this QR code, you'll be able to scan this code. And it'll open up on your device. And so what you're seeing now is you should see something that says like, hello, SPC. And it should say like, you can change this text in the source code and you'll see it updated on your device. And you should then see like a native camera view of like yourself smiling back at yourself. And so like now in about 90 seconds, we have, 7 of us already like editing a native app that will work across iOS, Android, and actually work on web too. It's obviously really basic, but imagine any other toolchain you can imagine, like using Xcode, using Android Studio. It would take you a lot longer to get started, to get going, etc. And the cool thing is like you can change this stuff really easily and really quickly. So if I change this like in line 11 where it says the text color was blue, I just changed it to red. And so on my device, and if you scanned my QR code, probably on yours too, like the text now updates to red. And I can change this other text here and just say, thanks for listening to me talk about this. And on your device, the text will change and you'll see that there. The other cool thing is like this does work on web. So on the tab here on the right, you can sort of see it says my device, iOS, Android, web. If I click on the web tab here, you'll see on my screen, like here's the web camera is actually using stuff and the text is there. And so we basically made this system that like lets you write code once in React and gives you the power of all kinds of native things. So let you build basically any app that you want pretty much. And from one code base, you can target iOS, Android, and web and have them update really, really quickly. And so the way we do that is, I'm going to go back to my slide deck. Through using a bunch of technologies that other people made and a bunch of stuff that we made. So sort of the foundation of a lot of stuff is called React Native. It's a library built by Facebook to help themselves build apps more quickly. So parts of Instagram, parts of the big blue Facebook app, like especially the marketplace part of it, and a lot of their new apps, a lot of their things like their ads manager and things that are built with React Native, because they wanted to be able to let people just like develop across all kinds of platforms more quickly. And they face the same challenge that almost every company building a consumer product does, which is like your users are on iOS, they're on Android, they're on web, they're on mobile web, and you need to reach them everywhere. And it sucks if you have to hire 3 separate teams and manage them all and try to keep them in sync. And so Facebook built this technology that lets you use React to do this stuff. And we've sort of built a whole set of tooling around it to make it actually easy to use if you're not Facebook. One way that people sometimes talk about Expo is kind of like, if React Native is Ruby, then like Expo is kind of like the Rails, like the sort of no-brainer thing that handles pulling everything together and giving you a standard library of stuff. In addition, one thing that Expo does automatically for you is gives you web support. There's actually a really good web support for React Native because this guy who's pictured here, named Nicholas Gallagher, was actually a guy working at Twitter a few years ago. He doesn't work there anymore, but he was tasked with like fixing their mobile website, which had been really slow and just kind of janky. And he had seen React Native and he really liked the model of it and the programming model. And so he came up with this crazy idea that he would build a React Native web renderer and then use that to build the new version of the Twitter mobile website. And he actually went off and did it, pulled it off and made it work. Twitter was really happy with the way that the mobile website looked and felt, and the metrics were really good. And so they actually took it and replaced their main website with this mobile website that's built on React Native Web. So this technology is actually really solid and sort of battle tested in production by one of the biggest websites in the world. And so the unfortunate part about React Native Web is it's not very easy to use out of the box. And so we've done a lot of work on Expo to make it kind of like automatically set up for you. So if you want to build your website as part of the same code base, you can. And the reason we ended up doing that was actually we were talking to this vegan meal kit company in San Francisco, kind of like Blue Apron, but for vegans. And they were telling us like, yeah, we're loving Expo because what we are is a vegan meal kit company. So we're not really a technology company. We're kind of like a food company. And that's number one. And then number two, we're like a logistics company because our next biggest challenge besides doing food is like getting it to people. Like we've got to manage all these delivery drivers and all these sort of orders and all these kind of things. And then third, we're a technology company because we do have a website and we do use technology to power business, but we only have 2 developers on staff, and we're not going to hire 20 more. We're probably going to be a small team for the foreseeable future. And so our customers kept telling us they really wanted an app, but we always felt like with only 2 developers, there's no way we can do anything except web, because 2 developers is very manageable for a website, but like, how would we even build an iOS app and keep it in sync, et cetera? But then one of our developers discovered Expo on a weekend and realized, hey, like we're building our website in React. Expo uses React, and it's as easy as building a website or easier. Put a prototype together. The CEO was super impressed, loved it, and said, hey, is there any way we can keep going with this? Is there any way we could actually build an app without having to expand our engineering staff? And they were kind of like, yeah, I guess we could, because it's all just React. And so they, it was basically for them not a choice of like which technology, but just like whether to have an app at all was made possible by the fact that Expo was really easy to use and fast. And so after talking to them, we kind of realized like, hey, like it's looking at their app, it's really, really similar to their website, but it's actually a separate React code base. It's sort of silly. And like, if you think about going forward, if you look at like modern applications, like if you look at TikTok, if you look at Instagram, if you go to their mobile websites, it's really, really, really close to their app product. And this is true for like, not cutting edge companies too, like United Airlines, if you go to their website, it's almost the exact same pixel for pixel as their app. And so what's happening more and more is people are realizing like, hey, it doesn't matter if you're on an Android phone or an iPhone or a mobile web browser on one of those phones. You're just looking at a black rectangle with a touch screen. Like you want to have pretty much the same experience. It doesn't matter how we deliver it. And so we thought it was really, really powerful. We could give you something where you just have one set of product managers and designers and engineers. They build one product and it can get targeted iOS, Android, and web. Anyway, tangent about why we think web is so important and why it's a big focus for us and why it's kind of uniquely part of Expo and not part of kind of default React Native and stuff like that. The second thing that is part of Expo is sort of a standard library of all kinds of components. Like you saw in that demo that I gave to you, like the entire code for the demo I gave you was just like all in one screen in the middle of the web page. And like part of the reason it was able to be that way is because with Expo, we provide this pretty big standard library of kind of every basic building block that you need when you're making a mobile app. And so one of those is like the camera. So there's like a very solid camera component that works on iOS, works on Android, works on web. And you can just kind of like stick it in and have it work. And if you don't need to do anything super crazy with the camera, you've now saved a whole bunch of time. There's all kinds of other things that people need a bunch of. Logging in with Google, almost every app these days lets you log in with like an Apple, a Google, a Facebook, some kind of OAuth, maybe using GitHub if it's a developer tool or something like that. Native maps is a really common thing that people want in mobile apps. Access to the other things like the gyroscope, the accelerometer, all the other sort of sensors on a phone. And then also all kinds of multimedia stuff, recording and playing sound, video, et cetera, et cetera. And then also sort of like low-level stuff that's just part of building an app. Like we give you access to a SQLite database if you want that. You can use secure storage, et cetera. And then another thing that saves a lot of people a lot of time, which might seem like a big deal, is notifications. We run a notification service so that like you can just kind of grab a token and say, hey, Jason needs to be sent a notification. I don't know whether he's on an iOS device or an Android device or whatever. Send this push notification to him. And that takes about 5 minutes to set up. Whereas if you follow the kind of tutorials for setting up notifications on iOS or Android, iOS I found to be even worse. But probably I think the last time I set it up, from scratch. It took me a day of just kind of like Googling some stuff, spending time on Stack Overflow, messing with like provisioning profiles and security credentials and stuff like that, and just not doing anything hard, but just kind of banging my head against the wall until all this configuration came together. Whereas most people who are like competent web developers can get notifications working with Expo in about 5 minutes. And so there's a lot of advantages to using this Expo system kind of from beginning to end of your app, because by having this integrated system, we can make things that are often laborious processes kind of come together more easily. So we have about 97 different APIs as part of this standard library. The other nice thing about them is that they kind of all have a fairly similar interface. Like if you use the sort of facilities for recording sound, and then you decide you want to record video later, you can kind of guess at what the function names are and how they work and how everything behaves, because there's sort of a coherence to the standard library. And if you want to use, say, store something from the camera roll to the file system, that uses the same file system API that like is part of the standard library here. So a lot of things in this reference each other and are sort of a coherent package. So one thing service we offer is we just like make this big standard library that handles all these basic building blocks. And we maintain it and test it and make sure it works with everything. The next thing we offer is this suite of services. And the reason we do that is that we basically realized like two things. Like one, there are just a bunch of things that developers are having trouble with that we couldn't help them by just giving them free open source software, but that we actually needed to operate a service running in the cloud. And we also realized that we had a lot of people telling us like, oh, I would really want that. I would pay you for that. And that this was like a good way for us to build a business. So we're in the process of rolling out these suite of services. We call it Expo Application Services, or EAS for short. And these handle a lot of the most important tasks that people have. These are all basically going to be paid services on a usage, sort of a lot of different plans, but it'll be kind of usage-based, but pretty affordable. And there'll be free plans to let people try stuff, kind of like most SaaS businesses. And I want to talk about two of the most important ones now, like build and update. The thing about EAS build that's really good is it basically is like lets you do cloud builds of iOS and Android apps. And this opens up a lot of different possibilities. One is it means that if you're using like a Linux computer or a Windows computer, you can actually build an iPhone app. And so we see lots of users who use Expo because if you don't have a Mac and you can't run Xcode, this is one of the only ways you can get a native feeling iPhone app. And so we're really popular in some countries for that reason. But it also means that if you are using a Mac or you're using a Windows machine, or I think most people in SPC are probably using a Mac, you don't have to keep Xcode up to date. You don't have to do this giant download. You can do a lot of things with this build service without ever having to actually even deal with downloading Xcode in Android Studio at all. The other thing that's really powerful about this is that even though we've built this giant standard library of like 97 different things, there's always something that somebody needs that isn't in there. And that might be like today, it might be like WebRTC support or some specialized Bluetooth use case, or maybe you want some kind of fluid simulator, or just there's all kinds of weird things in a long tail. Another popular thing that people include is like sort of analytics providers or ad network libraries, things like that. Those often come with these sort of native SDKs that people need to pull into their projects. And we'll run this cloud build service for you that'll let you include these libraries that you get from, either from Segment or Heap Analytics or whatever, or pull off GitHub or NPM, and we'll build them for you in the cloud so that you don't have to worry about it as much. You can also use this as part of your CI and just your general workflow or distributing alphas to customers, things like that. So ES Build is just this service that like takes care of a lot of the gnarly parts of that and does it in the cloud. There actually, Apple announced a sort of Xcode cloud thing yesterday morning. We're still processing like how that affects what we're doing. But in general, that probably just means that there's more possibilities for ES Build, and we can just like add even more power to it and make it work well with that. The other thing that's a really big deal is called EAS Update. And what this is basically, it lets you sort of push over-the-air updates of TypeScript or JavaScript to your apps like whenever you want. And so in the world of like web apps, the way that best practices have moved over the last decade is now it's really, really common for people to do what people call like continuous deployment, where every time somebody on your team makes a change and they do sort of a git push to master or main or release or whatever you call it, you'll run all your tests, and if they all pass, it just goes live. And there are a bunch of things that are really, really good about that. One is like, it means that when you make changes, they go out to your customers or your users faster, and people just see stuff faster. And that, there's all kinds of nice things about that. Like if you want to run some experiment and then collect some data and then make a change based on that, you can push out something in the morning, collect the data for a few hours, see the results, then make the change based on that. If if your CEO comes in and says, hey, we have to have a sale today, put a banner that says 10% off on the top of the app. You have a way to do that if you're using continuous deployment. And so the tricky thing is, like in the world of sort of native apps, this just hasn't been possible because these go through this process where you make a new big build and you ship that off to the Play Store and the iOS App Store, and then you wait maybe 2 or 3 days for those to go through review. Maybe they're accepted, maybe they're rejected. And then you wait for your users to kind of update through the Play Store or the iOS App Store, and then they're using the new version of your app. And it can be a process that maybe takes a week or even longer before they get your code. And so because of the way that Expo apps work, like most of your code ends up being written in JavaScript. It's just React code. And so we're able to push down, like when you make a change to your JavaScript or TypeScript code, you're able to tell us, and we'll use our CDN network to push out a complete copy of the new version of stuff, including assets, including code, including font, images, videos, whatever. And when that's fully downloaded by your users, the next time they open the app, they'll get the new version. And so what a lot of people who use Expo do is they use this to kind of do continuous deployment for their apps. And it gives them this like ability to fix bugs, this ability to push features faster, ability to make changes. Valve, like who makes Steam and Half-Life and Dota 2 and a bunch of other things, they actually switched most of their apps over they rebuilt them using Expo. And they told us the almost entire reason that they did that was that they wanted this update feature, because they just felt like they were not able to fix bugs and not able to be in touch with their users in a way that they felt was really necessary. And this is like, if you're not familiar with like doing native apps and you haven't done it before, you might not kind of know the pain and the frustration of like being like, I need to make this bug fix immediately, or I need to get this out, but I'm waiting for some random person in Cupertino or Mountain View or India to take a look at it, to give me the thumbs up so I can fix stuff that's broken for my customers. And this gives you like a way to actually solve problems and make things better for your customer. So it's a huge deal. And we handle all the complexity of making sure that like you don't push an incompatible version of JavaScript code to something that's broken, to like an incompatible binary or something like that. We handle all the management of things like that. A really cool example of this in action was when COVID hit. A bunch of people like wanted to do stuff related to, they want to help. But if you're a technical person, like there isn't obviously to do, but I think what a couple of people settled on was like doing symptom trackers, because before there was really widespread tests, one of the things that people thought would be helpful is just like, if we can get people all over the world to say how people are feeling, if a bunch of people start to say they feel sick in certain areas, then we can say, hey, there's probably an outbreak of COVID here. We should at least be worried about this or look at this. And so this health company in the UK called Zoe sort of said, okay, we're a big health company, we have a bunch of relationships, we could do this. Unfortunately, we think this needs to be an app, but we only have a couple of web developers on our staff. How can we build an app and get this out to people quickly? Because this is a pandemic, like this is for this to be meaningful, we need to get this out as soon as possible. And so what was really cool is the engineers at this company, they discovered Expo, realized they could learn it really, really quickly because they were web developers. And they built this app, and they built like the most minimal MVP. And they submitted it to the app stores for review. And in the sort of 48 to 72 hours that they were waiting for this to be reviewed, and come out, they kept working on the app. And so then once the app was reviewed and it got pushed into the app stores, they were able to like have it be more bugs fixed and add more features and have it be much more complete. And so once they got it into the app store and everything like that, they were able to use the fact they were a big health company with a bunch of relationships with universities and press and stuff. They would get a lot of publicity. And so they literally went from having the idea for this app to having it be in the stores and having 1 million users across iOS and Android within the span of like 1 week total. And the main reason that they were able to do that was that they were able to just like keep working the way you would on a website through that week because they were using the EAS update service. And so they wrote a nice blog. The screenshot is just from a nice blog post they cross-posted on our blog. So that's kind of like one of the main reasons that people really like Expo and use it for a lot of different things. So I don't know, I just kind of gone over a whole bunch of different stuff. I don't really know what all the people on this call or at SBC are building. And so I just thought I would leave a bunch of time for people to ask questions or dive deeper into any area of this stuff. We have a pretty big surface area of stuff that we do work on and offer, and I'm happy to answer questions about any of those things or connect you with the right person. And I also want to mention that we are a South Park Commons company, and so any other SBC founders and teams will kind of give you special attention and help and support because we want all of us to succeed. So cool. I'll stop screen sharing now. Yeah, happy to answer any questions people have or about this or anything else too.
There are a few questions in the chat from Jared. One of them about how testing works with Expo. Are you just testing React code, or do you guys have an Expo framework for it?
There's something called Detox that was made by a company in Israel called Wix that we do some work to support, and that is a pretty common way that people do testing in React Native. You can also use regular JavaScript testers like Jest, and obviously, like if you're just writing tests of your logic, you can use kind of any JavaScript testing framework to test things like that. But that's kind of an evolving space also. People are still working on new techniques and new libraries, but the things that I would look at are basically Detox and Jest are the most commonly used tools with Expo.
And then the next question might require a little background, but it's to ask you to compare Expo with Flutter.
Yeah. So Flutter is basically like a project from Google that solves a lot of the same problems with an approach that's like somewhat similar and somewhat different. I think like the fundamental idea with Expo and React Native is that people really like kind of the native app experience, and they want like native widgets, and they want, when they're using their iPhone, they want it to feel like I'm using a regular iPhone scroll view and I'm using a regular iPhone button, and and when people are using something that's like rendered using web technology or something like that, they often say it feels weird or like they're in some kind of uncanny valley, and then they don't engage with it as much, et cetera, et cetera. And so the way that React Native works is that you basically have like JavaScript running on a VM somewhere, and it's figuring out most of the logic. Like if you're pressing a button or swiping to transition to another screen or something like that, that'll run some JavaScript code that says, oh, you push that button, send a network request to this, or update some state that then React will figure out how to manifest on the screen or whatever. But then all of the actual views are sort of native iOS views. So it's like the text rendering and the scroll views and the rectangles and stuff that are styled. Those are all like UI kit level things, or on Android like views fragments, or I don't think fragments actually going to be used, but like that level of abstraction. Flutter is kind of taking a different approach that's more like a web browser, where they just kind of said, hey, like it's too complicated to deal with like one system on iOS with like UIKit and all this other stuff, and then another system on Android with their different iterations of material design and all this kind of stuff. And then if you're thinking about other platforms like desktop and web and all those other kind of things, it's too hard to think about all those things. Let's just like write one implementation all the way in the complete stack. And the way that we'll make it feel native is that we will take like a high-speed camera and we'll record all of the like animations and everything on iOS and on Android, and we'll mimic them like as close as we possibly can on a frame-by-frame basis. And we'll sort of imitate like what it feels like to be a native iOS app and what it feels like to be a truly native Android app, and we'll make sort of themes that work for those different platforms, even though it's sort of a single rendering engine across these things. And there's some really good things about that, and that like that works well on desktop, and it's pretty consistent, and you can actually like you can do funny things in Flutter where you can be on an iPhone and say, pretend I'm an Android phone and show me like an Android experience. And so then all of a sudden your scroll views, they stop bouncing when you pull it, even though you're on an iPhone, or you can do vice versa, where you're on an Android phone and you're saying, show me the iOS version of this, and the scroll views feel like they're an iOS thing. The problem with it, I think, that there's a couple of things that are not great about Flutter as it is right now. One is that everything in Flutter is Dart, which is sort of this like language made by some people at Google that's sort of halfway between JavaScript and Java. It's not a bad language, I don't think, but it's kind of one of these things that like I don't think anybody really loves it. But it is pretty. The one thing that it has over JavaScript is that from the beginning they designed it to be pretty performant, and so it probably runs a bit faster than any JavaScript implement, like even V8 or Hermes or these super fast JavaScript engines, because it's Dart. It has the people who worked on the VM for it, or the people who worked on V8, but sort of realized the limitations of what you could do with the JavaScript language, and actually said, hey, I can't make V8 any faster. Give me a new language that's a little bit more easy to optimize. And so there's some things that are really nice about that, where like, since the whole stack is written in Dart, if you can start modifying things at a deeper level more easily, but you also are using this sort of weird unpopular language that some people like, some people don't like. And sometimes things just feel weird. Like a lot of the Flutter apps I've used feel like a little bit, not as bad as like things that are rendered using web technology, but feel a little bit sort of like, I can't really put my finger on it, but I'm not quite sure why this isn't quite right. This either it feels like a slightly older version of iOS, or just something's a little off. But some people really love it, and it's gotten a lot popular. I'd say that like I would expect the way that the landscape plays out is that like React Native and /Expo and Flutter become sort of like two things that are both in the same ballpark of popularity, sort of the way that like Ruby and Python are, or C++ and Java, where like they're different enough that like people like one or the other for one reason or another, but they're similar enough that like, you use them for the same kind of problem space. One thing that is really good for Flutter is that Google takes developers seriously, whereas Facebook's approach is more like, we build React Native for ourselves, and here we'll make it open source and you can use it if you want. And so React Native on its own is not super usable and nice. And I think we've had to do a lot of work to make it like an actually pretty decent system. We still have a lot more to go. I think like there's all these ways that I can see how we can make Expo better. But whereas Flutter, I think Google actually has a big developer business. They have this Google Cloud platform. They have Firebase. They actually like think of developers as their customers, and they don't really use Flutter for a lot of things internally. I think they use it for the Stadia app, but they definitely, it's not like, whereas Facebook is using React Native for like Facebook, the main app, and Instagram, and some of these, not all of those apps, but like it's kind of like part of the most important things. Whereas Flutter is like sort of finding side projects that it can become part of and things like that, and targeting, and they're putting a big marketing effort at the developers. And so there's some things that are really nice about that, and some things that aren't as nice. And I think basically like people have found success with both of them. And if you're coming from a web background, I think it's a little bit easier to come into Expo, just because the workflow is more akin to web. And if you're familiar with React and JavaScript, it's pretty seamless transition. If you're coming from like a Java background or a native app background or something, or like writing desktop apps, it's probably easier to write Flutter because it's just more familiar paradigm, and you'll have more direct control from the get-go. Whereas if you want direct control in Expo, you have to learn Swift and Java or Kotlin, and like write specific modules for the specific platforms and stuff like that, which a lot of people want to do, but sometimes you don't.
Cool. We have a bunch more questions coming in.
Okay.
I'll get to them in an order that I think makes sense. Arthur and William both want to know the story behind. So Expo for many years worked on OS tooling, but did not yet sell anything. And then all of a sudden EAS came out and you have these services, and they want to know the story behind when and how that happened. How did you decide to start selling something?
Yeah. Well, I think with anything, like it's I think it just makes sense from a project perspective that if we make money, then that means we can hire more people, we can invest in it. Like, I think we could keep it as a super small team and like operate it as some sort of like fun open source project for the good of the world. And that would be pretty fun and cool. But I think like there's a lot of surface area here and there's a lot of stuff that we can do to help. And so we actually wanted to build it into a business, like, because we think that that's just like a lot more we can do and a lot more stuff problems we can solve for people and cool things we can add. And then also we just kept hearing from people like, oh, like this is so important to me. I would pay you so much if you added this. And a lot of times, like when we were offering a bunch of sort of early versions of these services for free to people, if they would use them a ton, we would sometimes be like, oh gosh, like these people are abusing us so much. And it's like, because when you're giving stuff away for free, like you're bearing all the costs for stuff and people don't care about it. Whereas like if there's something where it's like nicely aligned, where people start using our services, but they're paying for them, it feels great for everybody. I mean, unless they get a bigger bill than they expect or something like that. And so we think it like sets us up to actually build much better products for people. And it's also just based on people just telling us that they wanted us to like, just like email us and say like, hey, I love what you're doing, but like, I really want to pay you partly just because I feel like you deserve it. And partly because that'll give me confidence that like, you'll be around longer and like my boss will feel better about it. Just that we have more, like if we'd rather be a customer and feel like if we need you, then we can call you rather than like, if it's just free, all we can do is like file a GitHub issue or talk to you on Twitter or something like that. So a bunch of reasons why. But everything that's part of the EAS suite of services basically has come out of like conversations with existing Expo users and them just saying like, here's a situation. And then us realizing like, oh, we can solve that problem for you if we just like build this new service in this way.
Well, the next question you touched on a little bit when you talked about React Native Web, but James wants to know more about, there's this problem where when you're building something like Expo, where everybody who uses Expo uses it to build their entire application, then it gets hard to start an app and another thing and then switch over to Expo later. And so he's wondering more about like how hard it is to use Expo after the fact for an existing React app that's not yet React Native.
Yeah, we basically, sometimes people in the space talk about this as like brownfield versus greenfield. That might be a slightly different concept than what this question is addressing. But one sort of like dark moment for React Native was about 2 years ago. Airbnb put out this blog post that was like, Airbnb is sunsetting React Native. And why? And I think it didn't surprise me that happened because the way that Airbnb approached it is they had like a big iOS team and a big Android team, and they had these like totally native apps. And then they had some people come in and say, hey, we could use React Native and we can kind of do work once across both these platforms, et cetera. And they ended up with an app that was probably like 25% React Native and 75% native on each platform. And there's a bunch of things that are actually like structurally really hard about this sort of hybrid approach, especially in the native space. So like one part of it is sort of like cultural, where you have like these iOS developers and Android developers, and they're sort of seeing people write this other thing that's like sort of eating away the stuff that used to be their turf, and they don't really like it. There's a quote from Upton Sinclair, who wrote this like book called The Jungle about the meatpacking industry, that I think explains a lot of things in life. And it's sort of like, it's very hard to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And I think a lot of people who are sort of professional iOS, like Swift developers or Android developers, they really, really don't like things like React Native and Flutter because they're used to getting paid a big premium and being sort of exalted, important people at their tech companies because they have these special skills that like make them the only people that can work on this really, really important thing, like the app. And so, I think there was a real cultural clash inside Airbnb and other companies where they tried to sort of brownfield, but it's also like legitimate technical challenges that have nothing to do with really culture. Where, if you think about designing software, one thing that's really important is where's the source of truth for your state? And so, you can imagine like, I'm showing a profile screen of somebody. Let's say I'm showing a profile for Jason. And so I get Jason's name and I get Jason's, the data for Jason's photo. And if I'm using React Native, I'm going to stick most of that information in JavaScript variables. And sort of the source of truth is going to live in a JavaScript data structure. But if I'm writing a Swift app, I'm going to be making the network request using some sort of Swift library. I'm going to be putting that information into like Swift variables. And so then if you think about it, like if I have a hybrid approach where I have a bunch of stuff written in Swift and a bunch of stuff written in sort of React Native, then if I'm in the React Native part, but the data is living in Swift world, I have to kind of like go across the bridge between languages and sort of deserialize or unmarshal the data that way. Or I have to, if it's the other way around where I'm writing Swift code, but I want some information from React Native land, I have to go into the JS VM and pull the data out, and that's expensive or time consuming or just complicated. And then the other thing you could do would be to have like 2 copies of all the data, but that's inefficient and could lead to all kinds of surprising behaviors and bugs. And so there's kind of not any really clean way to navigate stuff like that. I think you can imagine somebody building something eventually, like a store that's in native but very accessible from JavaScript and uses memory mapping and things like that. But a lot of stuff isn't like fully built out yet because like this is somewhat new. And so I think that's what the companies like Airbnb ran into. And so long tangent, explain that. And companies like Coinbase that have like looked at that, and Coinbase just announced that the new Coinbase app is completely written in React Native from scratch and they started over. And the reason was they didn't want to deal with any of that complexity. And they just thought, oh, React Native can do everything that we need. So like, and if we need to augment one screen or something with native, we can always do that. But like, let's start from a clean code base instead of trying to like, mix these worlds and have a brownfield situation. I think for people that have a separate website and apps, it's really common for people to have their website be in just like regular, like using Next.js or sometimes Gatsby or just like create React app or whatever, but then build their app in Expo. And they maybe share some code, like some sort of state or logic and stuff like that. But often they don't even share any code. But what they do share is like, oh, our developers can bounce between different things because they're just writing React and they know React. And so it's just not that big a deal to go from writing React code in this world to writing React code here. And so there are different ways, but then there's also companies and projects that use, Expo for everything. And then they're writing one code base and it's targeting all these different platforms. So like the Stanford Daily newspaper is a good example of this, where they have one code base and it targets their Android app, their iOS app, and their website. And it's just like one single code base. They obviously have some things that handle stuff, especially on the web, to make sure that SEO works. And they have some special stuff for handling like navigation within an iOS app and internet app, like is a little bit different from on the web, etc. So it's not like but it's still a single code base. It just has special cases for the different platforms where it's appropriate. I hope that answered the question, even though I kind of bounced around, but across a bunch.
Yeah, I think so. Quick follow up on you talked about OTA updates earlier.
Yeah.
And why that's a big part of the whole thing and how some people, that's the main reason that they use it.
Yeah.
William wants to know what kind of concerns you run into from, Google Play and App Store about that kind of stuff and how it's changed over the years, maybe.
Yeah. So a lot of thoughts on that. One thing is like the rules, Google is much more, I mean, both Google and Apple sometimes give different people trouble for different reasons. But in general, Google is much more just open and like cool with whatever you do, as long as you're not creating a bad experience for your users. And so we see a lot fewer problems with people doing stuff on the Google Play Store. We definitely we've seen a handful of cases where Apple has asked app developers to not use any kind of OTA updating for a specific app. The most common case that we see this is for stuff related to like cryptocurrency things or other fintech things, where I think they see them as like particularly security sensitive and they don't want any kind of risk of fraud. But there's not really any rhyme or reason to it. And their rules, they also like, it's also very hard to interpret their rules. Their rules about this stuff are very vague and they change over time, and they also enforce them like very arbitrarily. Like we've seen almost identical apps submitted from different groups of people, and just they get different responses from Apple. And like anyone who's dealt with Apple at all in the App Store just kind of knows like you have no idea what they're going to do. They're just going to do whatever they feel like. A lot of how they treat you just depends on the luck of what reviewer you get, or whether there's some executive response to some email or whatever. So the way that we mitigate that is that we make sure that your app always works, even if you decide to turn off the update stuff or take out the module or whatever. And so when you submit your app to the App Store, we take a snapshot of all the JavaScript code and all your assets and all this stuff. We bundle it up with your app binary. So that way, like when the app gets downloaded from the App Store, it works right away. It doesn't need to connect to the internet or anything to work. This is also important because a bunch of people who use Expo actually have use cases where low internet connectivity settings are pretty important for them. So one of the early companies that was working with Expo in a serious way was doing a bunch of like trucking logistics. And they were telling us like, hey, like what might happen is we tell these truckers to download this app, but they might not open it right away. And they might be out in the desert in the middle of Utah where there's no cell towers for 100 miles. And then they open the app to log some stuff. And if the app doesn't work, that's a no-go. We need to make sure that it works out. So that's another reason why we put this behavior in where like we make sure we ship a complete copy of the app and stuff. And that's also a reason why it's pretty common that people, even though you can do a lot of updating over the air of stuff, people will still periodically submit a new binary to the App Store. One, they might upgrade like between, like we're always making improvements to the standard library stuff, and sometimes React Native goes through a version upgrade and stuff like that. And sometimes you want those things as part of your app, just in the same way you might upgrade random libraries from NPM and stuff like that. And so if you want to upgrade those native libraries, you have to do a new submission to the App Store. But then also it updates your snapshot when you do that, so that like, you know, if somebody downloads the first time and doesn't have a chance to connect to the internet, they're getting a newer, closer to cutting edge copy of your code. But in general, we don't have any super special insight into what Apple does, except that they're kind of random. And most, like 99% of apps that we've seen use the update stuff don't have problems, but a handful do. And the main thing that they do is they just stop using the update stuff and go on with their life, using the rest of the tools the regular way.
Cool. Next question is about WebAssembly. And there are a lot of people at SBC who are really interested in WebAssembly. There's actually like a little working group about it. And I mean, I remember 5 or 6 years ago when Wasm started to become kind of a thing, we were already talking about it at Expo and what future that might hold with Wasm plus React Native. Can you just kind of generally talk about your philosophy of Wasm and how that may or may not fit into React Native longer term?
I think Wasm is pretty interesting and exciting to me, because like I think it's one of these technologies where every once in a while things kind of come along where a lot of assumptions that people have had that were true when they sort of came to those conclusions, then like it changes things and you have to kind of reevaluate and update a lot of things. And I think a lot of stuff around like what kind of performance you can get out of a web page and things like that are really going to change, because of like there's a bunch of things in Wasm that, you know, giving you control over like memory and like when garbage collection happens or you know doesn't happen, etc. Like let you do things that just you couldn't have done previously in JavaScript, no matter how good things like V8 got. And so it's possible that, you know, you could actually pack really, really powerful computation into Wasm and have it a lot of the horsepower of an app be done there. And that's one of a couple of reasons why people feel like they need to write native code. The other reason people need to write native code is basically to access like device APIs. And that's something where like Wasm probably doesn't really matter that much, because like when you're probably just going to need to write some binding that is in Swift or Java or whatever if you want to access like the new you know, face reader or fingerprint reader or NFC reader or whatever kind of like peripheral or piece of hardware that you need some kind of private API into, or in some cases, like some of the new things Apple is announcing around like pop up the cancel subscription screen and stuff like that. Like that's going to be a call into some sort of native OS level thing. And it doesn't matter that Wasm is super performant to call into that. And so for those kinds of things, it's not going to really matter. But I do think that it's conceivable to me like that this, like one reason why I said that we were working on Expo and people were turning to things like React Native and Flutter is that web rendering and performance just never felt good enough and wasn't good enough for people. And that's been true for probably a decade. Like there was sort of a famous incident in like 2011 or 12 when Mark Zuckerberg announced that like the biggest mistake the company ever made was like making their app in HTML5 and like not building a native app. And they had, you know, put a tremendous amount of effort into rebuilding their app from scratch and pure native and not using the web rendering technology anymore. And that it's conceivable to me that like with WASM plus some other improvements that would have to be made in sort of the rendering engines in Safari and Chrome, you could actually get the performance that you want out of like a web view on mobile. And that could be really interesting. I still think there's a lot of work to do to like give people the app development experience they want. And so I think that like that would change the way that I think Expo looks at the world if that becomes true. And we would probably start using web for a lot more things where right now we rely on native, but a lot of things wouldn't change either. Like if you want to set like WASM doesn't change the fact that you can't send push notifications to a website on mobile Safari. And so like a lot of the stuff that people use Expo for is kind of like related to kind of native stuff like that. I don't know if that answers the question or not, but I think WASM, it surprised me with how performant it can be and how good you can make modern performance feel in web use.
You halfway answered the next question, Josh's question about performance, which is generally what performance is like for complex React apps. And he asked specifically, what would you tell a team that's had to do a lot of performance optimization to get good web performance? Like, will they see a speed up or lower performance?
If you're using Expo for your website, it'll be about the same. Like there's like, it's not, we typically like try to get you set up with using Next.js, which is a pretty common React web framework. It's using React. And so your state management and the complexity of your app is going to just dictate it. And using Expo, you're going to be basically the same as any other React app. And so if you have challenges, you're going to face challenges. And if you don't, you won't. And I think in general, I think there's people doing good work to come up with patterns and libraries and things like that help scale React applications because React is so popular. But I do think that for people who do push the envelope, there's definitely scaling challenges and things you have to worry about. This is also true when you're building Expo apps. Like if you build a big enough Expo app with enough moving parts, you can run into, and this is true, you know, of a Swift app as well. If you stick enough stuff on the screen and are keeping track of enough things and having enough stuff depend on other stuff, yeah, it starts to where you can drop frames or other kind of things. And there's work to be done there. I think in general, it's a stuff in the world of Expo is about as tractable to solve as stuff in the world of the web. Some of the debugging tooling is worse in Expo because we can't give you a direct access to the VM, the JS VM on the device. We're working on that, but we don't currently have access to that right now. I don't know if I really answered the question, but I tried. Sorry.
Y'all can talk about it later. Speaking of talking about it later, like Charlie said, they are a SPC company and, you know, tied here and it's casual and everything. So if anyone here is thinking about using Expo or you are using it and you want to talk to somebody on the team or whatever, just message me or Charlie or whoever. You can just message me on Slack and I'll find the right person there for you to talk to. They're the best. Do you have any like last thoughts, Charlie?
I'll just answer the last question that I see, which is just questions about fetching external assets in JS. In general, we haven't seen too much stuff, but I would say if you're in the middle of an iOS app review, fetching a whole bunch of code while the reviewer is monitoring your network requests is sometimes a way to get people's attention. So I'd not intentionally trigger some download of tons of JavaScript that does like in general, if the reviewers think you're being sneaky or doing something that like is where you're trying to, if it feels like you're trying to trick people and make an app that looks like it does one thing but really does something else, they get suspicious and start to get worried. And yeah, like Jason said, anyone on this call, just like be happy to help you as much as you can and dive into your specific problem and help you with whatever we can.
Cool. Osama concludes with not a question, but a thank you for sharing. And a big inspiration, which I agree with strongly. Expo is a really inspiring company. A lot of people have been working really hard on it for a really long time, and it's really cool to see people trudging away at it.
Yeah, thanks everybody for showing up. I'm very flattered. Thanks for your time.
This concludes our broadcasting.
Thanks, Charlie, and thanks